Wow, JD. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Jonathan, thank you really so kindly for this introduction. It feels great being back at the ICT, at the IDC, and at the ICT conference after a 2-year absence. And I'm really, really honored to have been appointed as the next Dean of the Lauder School of Government Diplomacy and Strategy. And I'd like to take this opportunity, first of all, to thank Professor Ariel Reichman, the founder and president of the IDC, for really entrusting me with the honor of leading this unique and vibrant school. I would also like to thank my dear friend, Professor Boaz Ganol. Many of you know Boaz as the head of the ICT, the director of the ICT, and for his also countless contributions to the study of counterterrorism and the practice of counterterrorism. But in addition to that, he has, of course, he's contributed an important body of work on terrorism. But in addition to that, he has really run for about 15 years. He has made enormous contributions to the effective administration of the Lauder School. He did so first as deputy dean of the school, and then in the last 5 years as the dean of the school. He extended an enormous amount of efforts to improve the school's curriculum, to develop cutting-edge educational programs, to represent the Lauder School in Israel and abroad, and to enrich our student body. And so his entrepreneurial spirit, his ability to connect to people, and his creativity, among many other qualities, are really inspiring. And I'm hoping that as I transition into the new role, into this role as dean, I'll count myself lucky if I can pick up, just a small amount of this positive energy that you exude. So thank you very much for all you've done. The IDC is special in a lot of ways, and one of the ways in which the IDC truly stands out is in the close relations between its faculty and its students. And this close relationship really manifests itself in a number of ways. One of them is in the way in which we really perceive our students, which is really as full partners in this academic enterprise. Another way in which our close partnership with the students manifests itself is in the many programs that are developed at IDC, which are specifically designed to encourage joint research collaborations between students and faculty. And the reason that I say this is that it's connected to the substance of my address today, because the research that I would like to share with you today is based on a 2-year project which I've been undertaking in full partnership with a former student of mine, Michelle Vues from Switzerland, who was here, who is now a scientific assistant at the Swiss Military Academy. And so over the last 2 years or so, Michelle and I have investigated the evolving nature of conflicts in which the conflict actors are relying on proxies in order to achieve their strategic and political objectives. So I'm happy to say that our joint research is forthcoming in the journal International Security in the spring. And in the remaining time that I have, I'd like to share with you the main research questions that we address in this topic, the main findings, and some of the implications of these findings for international security. So the history of armed conflict features many examples in which the main conflict parties have relied on proxies or surrogates to advance their goals. In recent years, this practice seems to really have become much more endemic. And if you look around in conflicts such as in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, or the Ukraine, we can see this happening in front of our eyes. Now, scholars and strategists have examined the causes, the nature, and the consequences of proxy sponsorship. But interestingly, the vast majority of these studies have a very particular understanding of the relationship between the sponsors and the proxies. In this conventional wisdom, it is almost always states who are the sponsors and non-states who are seen as the proxies. Think, for example, Iran, of course, being a state sponsor of Hezbollah, a non-state actor, as the proxy. So while this state-centric approach, in which the role of sponsorship is almost exclusively ascribed to states, may have been true during the Cold War, and it certainly still applies in many cases today, Michelle and I believe that contemporary relationships between sponsors and proxies do not necessarily and always follow this established pattern. So in our research, we argue that in recent years, non-state actors have adopted the capacity to act as sponsors in their own right, much like states have previously acted exclusively as such sponsors. This applies to groups as varied as Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, or the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, all of whom have basically served as non-state sponsors of non-state proxies. Now, this trend is not entirely new, but it is acknowledged in only a very, very small number of studies. And more importantly, the causes, the nature, and the consequences of this trend have not been properly addressed. So in our research, Michelle and I, we tried to begin filling this gap by asking, first of all, why and how do non-state actors sponsor proxies? And secondly, what are the implications of this non-state sponsorship for international security? So to answer these questions, we've compared 3 case studies. We have looked at AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula's engagement of Sunni Bedouin tribes in Yemen. Secondly, we have looked at the YPG, the Kurdish People's Protection Units in Syria, and its sponsorship of proxy groups. And third, we've looked at Hezbollah, right? Now again, Hezbollah is typically seen as a proxy of Iran, which of course it is. But we've looked at Hezbollah also as a sponsor in its own right? And we have looked at Hezbollah sponsorship of the Lebanese Resistance Brigades, which is a militia in Lebanon. Now, our study suggests that non-state sponsors utilize proxies differently and for different reasons than state sponsors have utilized theirs. The existing literature suggests that state sponsors, right, the conventional type of sponsor, that state sponsors have traditionally regarded their proxies as a predominantly military tool to achieve their goals. States who sponsor proxies view proxies as a cost-effective way to achieve strategic goals while minimizing the risks of the state sponsor becoming embroiled in a major international confrontation. So what about non-state sponsors then? Well, in contrast to state sponsors, we argue that non-state sponsors rely on proxies not necessarily as military tools, but rather as political instruments. Non-state actors use proxies as political ancillaries rather than as military surrogates. As such, proxies can help advance the political objectives, and these political objectives oftentimes revolve around enhancing the sponsor's quest for legitimacy in theater. This does not mean that to non-state sponsors, proxies are militarily irrelevant, but it means that the types of military skills that are important to non-state sponsors basically revolve around secondary security and safety operations. So in practice, we argue that non-state sponsors will often seek out proxies who represent, for example, broader segments of the local population, and they will primarily utilize these proxies to enhance their political influence. In our article, we find very strong support for our argument in the case of Al-Qaeda in Yemen, which has essentially used local Bedouin tribes as proxies, precisely because these tribes have been able to enhance AQAP's legitimacy vis-a-vis the local population. We also find strong support in how the YPG, which is a Kurdish group based in Syria, has used Arab, Turkmen, and Christian proxies in a bid to enhance its political influence among those communities. But perhaps most importantly and most interestingly, we find that our argument also applies in cases when a non-state sponsor is already very politically powerful. Right? So if you look, for example, at Hezbollah, Hezbollah is a country which has an estimated annual budget of about $1 billion. And of course, politically, it is a major political force in Lebanon. It is very well entrenched in the country. So in our study, we examined Hezbollah's sponsorship of the Lebanese resistance brigades, and we find that in accordance with our theoretical expectations, these brigades are of very little military use to Hezbollah. However, they are of great political use for Hezbollah because the resistance brigades, this proxy, is composed of Lebanese of all stripes, Sunnis, Shiites, Druze, Arabs, Muslims, and non-Muslims alike. And so the reason why Hezbollah has sponsored this organization is so that it can pretend that Hezbollah is not simply a Shiite organization, but that it's an organization that allegedly represents Lebanese of all stripes. So what are the implications? What are then the implications of this trend of non-state sponsorship for international relations, for international security? We believe that as the role of non-state actors in general in the international arena, in international relations in general, steadily increases, so will the role of non-state sponsorship. We've seen this in cases of Al-Qaeda. We've seen this in cases of the Islamic State, both of whom have sponsored numerous other smaller, lesser organizations. Michelle and I believe that most of these sponsor-proxy relations, in which the sponsor is a non-state actor as opposed to a state, will be that these relations will be less asymmetric. They will actually be more even, right? There will no longer be a huge power gap between the sponsor and the proxies as we used to know them from the age of state sponsors. Traditionally, sponsor-proxy relationships, such as those between Iran and Hezbollah, have featured two actors who have differed in capacity tremendously. Right? Iran is has far greater capacity than Hezbollah. But such power gaps, we believe, will be less pronounced between most non-state sponsors and their proxies. And the reason is that the proxies of non-state sponsors, they offer unique advantages that help reduce this capacity gap between sponsors and proxies further. Precisely because these proxies of non-state sponsors have so much political power on the ground when compared to their sponsors, they have an outsized importance. Add to that the fact that many non-state sponsors are not yet militarily or politically secure in their position. And so these dynamics will raise the overall profile of proxies. Let me just say that, so the resulting relationships, we believe, of non-state sponsors and their proxies are going to be a lot more transactional, probably far less ideological, and much more uneven, but also subject to manipulation. And so in all of this, there's both bad news and good news. The bad news is that such relationships between non-state sponsors and their proxies will become more common, and future armed conflict, as a result, will become more complex. But the good news is that these new types of sponsor-proxy relationships will oftentimes be very transactional, they'll be very pragmatic, they'll be shifting in accordance to changing interests of the proxies, and therefore, this makes these types of relationships much more susceptible to external manipulation. Thank you.